Welcome back to another week of the Multifaceted Athlete. This week I'm joined by a guest who was on episode 27. Her name back then was Dr. Sarah Ceschin. She is now Dr. Sarah Zimmer. Sarah, welcome back to the podcast.
Kelly, thank you so much for having me again. I'm so excited. And this has been so fun. So I'm excited to chat again today.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So, for anyone who hasn't listened to episode 27, Sarah is a physical therapist. She is my physical therapist, so I love her. And I can't even remember what we covered in that episode, but we covered a lot. And this one, we're going to be a little more targeted. We're going to talk about hip and ankle mobility for running.
I remember in the last episode, we talked a lot about like some good hot topics.
Oh, yes.
Should you stretch? Should you not? Should you like use ice? I can't remember exactly. But the title of the episode was "Muscles Are Like Accordions," and I was like, "Oh man, I wonder what nugget I'm gonna say today."
Yeah, I remember when I was editing, you said that phrase, and I was like, this is perfect.
This is Sarah.
It was great.
Yeah.
But yeah, highly recommend if you haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to that. But yeah, let's just dive right in. So, Sarah, can you explain for everyone what exactly do we mean when we say hip or ankle mobility?
Yeah, I love this question. I get this question a lot because, and you had mentioned this while we were talking before starting to record, people get mobility and flexibility really confused, and they are two different things. So, mobility, when we talk about hip mobility or ankle mobility, it is really just referring to a joint. And so when we talk about hip mobility, it's the ability to actively take your joint through a range of motion, and ideally through its full range of motion or whatever it has available to it. So it's very much more of an active thing. But flexibility is a little bit more referring to like the muscles and the fascia and the connective tissue, and it's a little bit more passive. So if I were to look at my hamstring flexibility, it would be like, how far can somebody push my leg overhead to see how flexible that tissue is in its entirety, and it's a little bit more passive. So why we tend to focus on mobility more is because that's just what's generally happening while we run, while we move. We have to have the active components of range of motion to have healthy joints, to have good movement, to reduce compensations. So that's kind of why when you see a PT or with your running coach or whoever, we talk more about mobility versus flexibility.
Yeah, and for anyone who has followed me for a while, you know my ankle mobility sucks. My ankle joint does not want to move a lot. And then for flexibility, I would say, would you consider the Achilles to be a flexibility thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would consider that you could. That's a really good question. I guess you could make it more flexible by passively being able to stretch the whole unit. But when we talk about stretching, we're not really just stretching one thing. So if I were to stretch your ankle, this is where it gets kind of confusing. But if I were to take your ankle to stretch your calf and your Achilles, you're gonna eventually get that whole unit. So I'm not just stretching my Achilles, or I'm not just stretching my calf. You are kind of changing the length of the entire thing, although more of that change in length is going to happen at the muscle more than the tendon itself. You can't really stretch a tendon a ton and make a ton of change. I feel like that conversation happened a lot with the IT band. Like, you can't really stretch your IT band. Good luck trying, but it's tough. So yeah, probably not so much your Achilles as much as like your calf and all the other structures around it.
Yeah, so that makes sense because that's definitely one of the contributors to my ankle mobility is that, as Sarah knows very well, my calves are always very wound up, if you will.
That's a word.
That is a word, yeah. So then in terms of running, let's start with ankle mobility. First, how much do you quote unquote need? And then how does someone know if they have enough?
Ooh, yeah. So Really, your ankle needs mobility in a lot of different directions, and most of the time we're talking about ankle dorsiflexion, so how much you can pick up your foot. I'm realizing that I'm such a hand talk person that no one can see what I'm doing, so I have to be good with my words on a podcast. But yeah, ankle dorsiflexion is one that most people lack. I would say it's the one that people lack the most of, and it's the ability to pick up your foot. And we need that in two instances specifically when we run. So when our foot hits the ground, both our heel and our forefoot, and then as our shin bone or our tibia is starting to move forward, you need ankle dorsiflexion while your foot is in contact with the ground. Whether you're a heel striker, a forefoot striker, your shin bone is still moving forward, so you have to have ankle dorsiflexion in that instance. And then the other big time that you need it is when your leg is behind you and you're swinging it forward. So in order for you to not trip over your feet, you need ankle dorsiflexion to be able to pick up your foot as you swing it forward. And there's a lot of compensations that can happen either when your leg is swinging or when your leg's on the ground, if you don't have enough ankle dorsiflexion mobility. I will say that this is a little bit less common in what I've seen just anecdotally, but ankle plantar flexion, so being able to point your foot, is also really important. And there are times in which people can lack plantar flexion or the range of motion to the mobility to point. And that's obviously common or needed when you're in push-off while you're running. And that, too, if you don't have enough ankle plantar flexion, can contribute to some other injuries like peroneal tendinitis. Sometimes it can contribute to ankle or Achilles tendinitis. So it's still something to be aware of. But I would say more often than not, we just need to work on ankle dorsiflexion.
That makes sense. And that's definitely my issue. So actually, one thing I haven't talked to you about yet, but since our last visit, so for anyone who doesn't have this context, which is no one outside of you and I, last time I went to see Sarah, we did like basically a gait analysis videos. And we noticed that I overstride a bit, so I've been working on higher cadence on some of my runs. And I revisited those videos after our appointment, and I noticed when my leg is swinging forward, my ankle is not dorsiflexed much. I'm like pointing my toes, so I've also been trying to focus on that to like help with the landing under my hips and versus in front.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you mind me asking how that has felt? Because I feel like cadence gets talked about a lot and trying to work on that, and it feels weird. I don't know. What has your experience been like?
It does feel weird. So trying to increase cadence has felt really hard, except when we go on runs together with our friend Brad, then my cadence is naturally higher because we run faster. But trying to like actively dorsiflex my ankle in the swing phase has felt weird because that's not my natural gait swing. But it feels more like, so David and Megan on their SWAP podcast, they mentioned like thinking of your gait more as like your foot moving in a circle versus like back and forth. And when I dorsiflex my ankle more, I feel like I am more like on a wheel, if that makes sense.
I love that analogy. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
So it feels more like, this is a weird analogy, but I don't remember which cartoon character it is, but it's like, I don't know, I don't think it's the Roadrunner, but one of those characters that runs and their foot literally just goes in a circle. That's what I feel like.
It like goes in a circle and like picks up dust and then they run really fast.
Yeah, exactly.
Roadrunner.
Is it Roadrunner? But that's what it feels like when I try not to point my toes when because this is what we talked about in the appointment. It like looks like I'm reaching for the ground versus like landing and pushing off.
Yeah. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that happens a lot too, is that people with overstriding, or if there's ankle mobility issues or whatever, that people end up pulling themselves forward instead of pushing themselves forward.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then that can cause a whole lot of issues upstream.
Yeah. And I kind of like the way this conversation has gone, because when we work on ankle mobility with exercises or stretches or whatever, it is really important that you then translate that into actively pursuing it while you run to some extent. Like there's an amount that if you work on it with exercise, it will just show up in your mechanics too. But not 100%. Like there is an amount of like conscious work that is done when you're working on your form, where you have to put it into practice, if you will.
Yeah, I remember reading, I want to say it was in Running Rewired or Anatomy for Runners, one of
Oh yeah,
those books.
those are great.
Yeah, it was, I think he said that like once you increase your range of motion, then you have to practice using the full range of motion. It's not going to just like come to you.
Absolutely, because a lot of the times in running or just with movement, the way we move is like neuromuscularly based or like centrally driven through habits. So you can work on ankle dorsiflexion all you want, but you already have this like motor pattern of how you're moving. So exactly right, like you eventually then have to use the new mobility in the correct way and like practice that movement. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Can you talk a second about heel toe drop and how that affects people with ankle mobility issues?
Like with shoes?
Yeah. Like, because I know I was on a hunt for a while to try to find higher drop shoes so that the ankle mobility would be less of a hindrance. Ultimately, I failed, so I'm still in my pretty low drop shoes, but they just feel better to me. Partially, this is not necessary for this conversation, but partially because of like the wide foot toe boxes and all that. But yeah, can you talk a bit about that? How different drops affect how much you need to use your range of motion in your ankles?
Yeah, yeah. So with higher drop shoes, so the drop, just so that everyone knows what we're talking about, is the difference in height between your heel and your forefoot, essentially, in a running shoe. And so a higher drop means that there's a greater distance. So the heel is higher than the forefoot, and in a lower drop shoe, it's just getting flatter and flatter. The highest I've seen, Kelly, I don't know if you've seen anything higher, but I feel like the highest I've seen is like 12 to 14 millimeters in
Yeah,
a
that
running
sounds
shoe.
right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's quite high.
That's quite high. That's quite high. And no judgment if that's the shoe that works for you. And then obviously the lowest is a zero drop shoe, so meaning that like there's literally no change in difference. Your foot is pretty much flat with the ground. So a higher drop shoe, you can think about it almost as like a high heel. So it takes out some of that ankle dorsiflexion. So your ankle's actually sitting a little bit more pointed or into plantar flexion, with your heel being higher than your forefoot. So people with really stiff ankles or ankle mobility issues sometimes do well in a higher drop shoe, like you're saying, because it takes out that component of your running form. And then you just don't have you have less of those compensatory patterns, because now the shoe is fit to your ankle structure or the amount of mobility that you have. I will say though, and then, well, I should say vice versa when it goes to zero drop shoes. So zero drop shoes, your ankle will definitely have to work more in its range of motion, or it'll force you to need more range of motion, ankle mobility wise. I will say though that I do struggle with using shoes to meet us where we're at or try to correct something that we have, because as you become a more seasoned runner, as you do more strength training and stretching and all that kind of stuff, your mobility, your mechanics, all that's going to change. And so the type of shoe you're going to need changes with that. And I think that if you put a higher drop, if you put a person with less ankle mobility in a higher drop shoe, yes, that might behoove their ankle a little bit, but that doesn't mean it's doing great things above the chain. So it doesn't mean it's doing great things for your knee or for your hip, because those higher drop shoes do tend to change or promote different foot striking patterns, And so there again, it may not behoove you from the whole rounded standpoint, if you're just focusing on when it does at the ankle. That was wordy. I hope that made sense.
That does make sense. And that's all. I feel like anything around shoes, that's always like a good advice. Like, don't, how do I want to say this? Not, I was going to say, like, don't use the shoe as a band-aid if you have an issue, but it can help. Well, it's kind of like, okay, when I first came to you, I think we talked about this in episode 27 when we first chatted. I was wearing insoles, and you were like, this is a good temporary fix, but long term, we want to build up the strength in your foot so you don't need them. So kind of like the same thing with the higher drop shoe if you are using it for poor mobility.
Yeah, absolutely. Shoes can be like a great tool, especially like a stability shoe can be a great tool while you're building up that stability. And then once you have it, a stability shoe actually might not feel great anymore. So yeah, same thing with drop in your shoes, and being able to tolerate different. I know people switch on and off between shoes, so you want to be careful with what the drops are in each shoe, because even like a 3 to 4 millimeter difference is quite a lot for your joints and for your body. So yeah.
Yeah. Can we go down a shoe rabbit hole for a second?
Take me with you.
So this doesn't have to do with ankle mobility, but it reminds me of an Instagram post that you put out recently. And if I recall correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, the post was about kind of like the hype around lower drop shoes. And the point of your post was, yes, you could do that, but then you're also going to need to work on your calves and everything around it that will be altered from shifting your shoe to the lower drop. So can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up my Instagram post. I kind of actually don't remember that Instagram post, but I think it also is related to, I did one recently too that talked about like since we're also talking about running form, the post talked about kind of gait mechanics and running form, and either with zero drop shoes or with changes in your running form, like if you're working on cadence, you have to work on the muscles that are going to support that change. So when you're going into a zero drop shoe, you're going to use a lot more of your calves and the ankle or the muscles around your ankle for stability and arch support and so when you put yourself in a zero drop shoe or you increase your cadence or any sort of change, you want to make sure that you're doing that strength work to support the change. It's not always like a magic, like, oh, I switched my shoes and everything feels better now, or I increased my cadence and that was the magic fix. It might for like a hot second, but you have to be able to support it with now this new demand that you're putting on your body from wherever that's coming from.
Yes, that is the post I was thinking of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll link that one because I think that's a really good post and something that people don't often think about when they are trying to make changes either to their form or to their shoes. So yeah, we'll link that one for everyone.
I'm glad it was helpful because it's also something, I mean, it's funny. I feel like I make those posts too because of things that I'm reminding myself of and learning as a clinician. Like, oh yeah, whenever, like, changes are good, but that doesn't mean when you make the change that you have the foundations to support whatever change that is. Which I feel like all these conversations always go back to making time for the foundations, whether that's like working on your mobility, strength training, fill in the blank here. We always have to be kind of working on those things to support what's happening in the actual sport.
Yeah. Okay, so back to ankle mobility. How do you know if you have enough for running? Because for running, for everyone not aware, is very different than what we see a lot on social media where, 5 inches away from the wall, if you can touch your knee, you have enough ankle mobility. But for running, we don't quite need that full range of motion.
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question to ask yourself how you know you have enough. I think it's a tough thing to analyze yourself. Like you're saying at home, it's tough to put your foot 5 inches from the wall and touch your knee to the wall and be like, yep, I'm good. Because I think that's where it needs, I know I'm biased, but I think that's where it needs like another pair of eyes to look at, is this a quality movement? Like, okay, my knee touched the wall, but are my hips kind of rotated to accomplish that task? Is my heel, so your foot is divided into different parts, and you have your forefoot, your midfoot, and your rear foot. So when I talk about the rear foot, I'm talking about the heel. And if your knee touches the wall, but your rear foot is like really rigid in that, and depending on what happens with your arch, then like, yeah, okay, you might think you have enough ankle mobility, but it's not coming from the right places, or there's compensations there that are allowing you to complete the task at hand. So I think when you're trying to figure out if you have enough ankle mobility, I do think it's worth maybe asking your asking your coach, or seeing a PT or a chiropractor, whoever you go to just kind of take a look at things. There's a lot of research that shows you need 10 to 20 degrees past neutral. So if your ankle bends to a 90-degree angle, you need an extra 10 to 20 degrees for running specifically. And I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true for everybody. I will say anecdotally, I've never seen that. And I know there's people out there probably with not that much and they're doing just fine. So I do think it depends too on the rest of your anatomy. And what's happening at your hips, what's happening at your knee, blah, blah, blah. That kind of changes what you need. As far as ankle mobility goes. I do think it also changes kind of the type of running you're doing too. If you're doing a lot of trail running, your ankle has to move in so many different degrees of freedom, or ranges of motion. You tend to be a little bit more in the balls of your feet, or kind of more in a plantar flex position at times, especially when you're running uphill. What your ankle's required to do just changes so much depending on your terrain and all of that. So to be really nitpicky about specific ranges of motion, I don't know if it is super fair. But I would say for most people, if you're at a 90-degree angle, you probably need at least an extra 5 degrees.
Okay.
Just for sake of running. And it's also where gait analysis or having someone watch you walk is really helpful too. Because again, you might have enough ankle mobility, but what's happening when you use it functionally, especially because your ankle dorsiflexion is not just your joint, it's also what your muscles are doing too. So kind of like what we were saying before, if you have enough, but while you're running, you're still just pointing your foot through swing phase. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, we need to address that piece also. So the knee to wall thing is kind of an easy assessment if you know how to properly set it up. It at least gives you a general idea. I don't know if it's the full picture, but it is a general idea if you want to try it at home.
So basically, you can do the knee to wall, but if you are concerned about ankle mobility, you'd be better off just going to see a professional and getting a professional opinion.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're concerned about it from an injury standpoint, if there is any sort of pain or tightness or discomfort, and you're unsure if ankle mobility is contributing to that, I think it's worth asking somebody, whoever that may be. But if your ankles have been feeling fine and you're not that concerned about it, I think it's still a good test. And I usually tell people measuring 5 inches might not be fair to everybody because everybody's anatomy is different, but I usually tell people to just use their whole hand on the ground. So if you put your whole hand on the ground and put your foot at your thumb, so your pinky side is at the wall, thumb's pointing to you, you put your foot at your thumb side. Mm-hmm. No one can see my hands.
I'll make a reel so they can see.
Okay. And then you put your foot behind your thumb side, and then you try to touch your knee to the wall. That can work for a lot of people. And if it can, and you're not twisting your hips or compensating any sort of way, or your knee's not caving in, blah, blah, that can be a good tool of okay, I think I'm decent.
Cool. Yeah. Honestly, I don't hear a lot of runners talking about ankle mobility, except me, because we all know it is one of my issues. But like I told you before when I invited you on, I have been getting quite a few questions about hip mobility. So, can you talk a bit about hip mobility and why that is important for running?
Yes. Yeah. So hip mobility. So same, I guess, same as ankles in that there's an amount of ankle mobility that you need for healthy running, to avoid injury, to avoid compensations, all that kind of good stuff. And so again, hip mobility, we're talking about that full range of motion that you can actively go through, and that's both like flexion, so bringing your knee up towards your chest. That's extension. That's super important. So swinging your leg behind you, and then internal rotation and external rotation. So that rotational component of your hip, again, important. And then there is also the two ranges of motion: abduction, so abduction, and then adduction, adduction. So if you think about your leg in like a snow angel kind of movement, or windshield wiper movement. I said the word snow angel to a patient one time who was not from anywhere that had snow and legit had no idea what I was talking about. I was like, oh, I'm from Wisconsin. I thought everyone knew what a snow angel was. Anyway, so like windshield wiper motion. And so you need adequate motion in all of those different planes. Even for running, there are motions that you need more of, like you need more of flexion and extension. Those are probably the most important. And then you need internal and external rotation. And then I would say abduction and adduction are, you need them, but it's not as big as the ranges of motion you need for everything else. And so if you don't have that mobility, and probably what I see the most often as far as what we lack is extension, so bringing our leg behind us, and then internal and external rotation. So if you think about external rotation, that's like a pigeon pose position with your leg in front of you. And internal rotation is just the opposite of that. So those are probably the ones that I see to be lacking the most for runners. And how that shows up injury-wise is sometimes like, piriformis or low back pain or SI joint issues. It could be like groin pain or pubic bone pain. Sometimes it causes IT band stuff. It can even contribute to things at the foot. So it's really important to focus on that mobility up at the hip, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like the hip region is very important for like so many aspects of running, mostly because there's so much going on around there that, connects to other places and affects other parts of our bodies that hurt. But yeah, I've been dealing, as you know, with the hip flexor, which I don't think we think is from hip mobility, but could be.
It could be. It's what's interesting about the hips is that it really is like the core of our movement, if you will. Like the foot, where we're talking about hip and foot, is that they both have to work together, and they're both really important, especially for running, obviously. And you have to be mobile and stable and strong in those joints for everything else to kind of feel great, specifically your knee. Usually if there's a knee issue, we look above and below the knee because there's probably something going on mechanically up and down there. But with the hip, if your stride length is right, you're landing fairly underneath you, like your hip is where we want most of that load to come through from the ground. And so making sure that you have enough mobility and then strength in the muscles that create that mobility and stability in there is like one of the most important pieces for running. Like I think to give an example, people talk a lot about hip drop. So when you're running, if you're landing on your left leg and you see your right hip drop, that can be like a hip strength and mobility issue, which leads to all sorts of injuries, as we know. Hopefully you don't know, but as we know. Yeah, so I feel like the hip is kind of one of the more important aspects or important parts of our body that we really need to focus on for healthy running, for sure.
Yeah, what I find so interesting about the hips is like any given person who says like, "Oh, my hip is hurting." There are so many different areas they could be referring to. So that's partly why I wanted you to explain what exactly is hip mobility, because some people, when they're talking about their hips, they're like, their glute medius is what's bothering them, or their hip flexor, or high hamstring. Obviously, those aren't dealing with mobility of the joint, but just the hips as a whole region.
Yeah, well, if you think about, I guess to kind of go off of that, when we talk about the hip, there's, I think, like 15 muscles kind of surrounding the hip that are involved in its motion and its stability and its strength. So if we take like hamstring, let's say, hamstring tendinopathy, it could be a mobility issue if, let's say, you don't have enough hip extension, and so you're not able to use your glutes as appropriately, as efficiently as you want to, and so your hamstrings kind of taking up the rest of that motion, because athletes are like crazy smart. Like our bodies are going to figure out how to complete the motion or the task for whatever it currently has available to it. So if it does have enough hip extension and it can't use its glutes, great, I'll use my hamstring more. Sweet. For a little bit. So these even hip flexor stuff, like for you specifically, Kelly, or for anybody, like if we're having some hip flexor issues, like is it a mobility piece? There's probably some sort of tightness in there. That could be extension, that could be flexion, that could be internal rotation. Because when we don't have enough internal rotation, and we maybe are sitting in just more external rotation, it does kind of pull on our psoas, or hip flexors a little bit, and so maybe they're just being overstretched. Sometimes it's a mobility issue, but it's also kind of a motor pattern issue. So like, is it because I'm lacking a little bit of this motion and I'm not using my core appropriately to help me swing my leg forward? So now I'm just like really overworking my hip flexor. It can be a multitude of things, and it's not always the same thing for everybody that has hip flexor pain. It's really important to figure out like what is the source, or what is the most contributing factors, I should say, because it's not always just one thing. If that answers your question.
Yeah, I don't remember what my question was, but that was great. Okay, so same question as with ankle mobility. How might one suspect that they need to work on hip mobility?
That's a good question. I would love your thoughts on this too. I think there are some movements or positions that you can put yourself in that can kind of test if you have enough mobility. Like, can you get into a pigeon pose, or can you sit in like a butterfly position, or kind of crisscross applesauce? Is that uncomfortable? Okay, that might mean you have some rotational deficiencies in your hip mobility. Can I, in a pigeon pose, is the leg that's behind me really uncomfortable? Do I not have enough like hip extension or enough mobility in my hip capsule to allow for my leg to be behind me? Even sometimes like pelvic tilts. So your pelvis. So when we talk about hip mobility, oh, maybe I should have said this first. When we talk about hip mobility, we are talking about just the hip joint, which is your femur bone into the socket of your pelvis. And so it's that ball and socket kind of joint that moves all around in circles and such. So when we're talking about hip mobility, it is that particular joint. Your pelvis has its own mobility as well. So you can have you can tilt anteriorly, you can tilt posteriorly, which is back and forth. There's also a rotational component to your pelvis a little bit. And not being able to dissociate your pelvis from your spine or from your hips, that stiffness can cause issues somewhere. So for hip mobility, we're talking about just true socket motion. But for like an anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, if you can't tilt your pelvis enough back and forth, that might be indicative of like, oh, is it because my hip flexors are too tight? Is it because I don't know how to find my glutes? there's a lot of reasons for that, but being able to tilt your pelvis back and forth is also really important for having enough like hip flexion and extension. So if I'm trying to bring my leg into hip flexion, but it feels a little tight, is my pelvis not tilting posteriorly enough to help bring it around, to bring it into flexion? I just got real complicated, didn't I?
No, I think that's helpful.
Okay.
I just want to say in layman's terms, for anyone, anterior is tilting towards your front, posterior is tilting towards your back.
Thank you so much. For saying that.
I know we know those terms, but when you're not seeped in the field, it can be confusing.
Yeah, and a
But
way to kind of do it at home is like if you try to find your hip bones, so like on the front of your hips, you should have these like bones that kind of point out on the front. And on the back, you have your SI joints. So there's like the dimples of your low back. Those are joints. And so if you put your hands on your hips and you try to find the bones on the front and the dimples on the back, that's where that forward and backward motion should happen. So like Kelly said, forward is anterior tilt. Backward, which is like tucking your tailbone down, that's a posterior tilt.
I always find it helpful when people refer to the pelvis as like a bowl.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really good analogy. And tipping a bowl forward and backward. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it, for whatever reason, for me, it just connects like visually, like what I'm doing when I'm moving the pelvis.
Yeah, it's good to have those visuals. A really good hip mobility exercise that might help with visuals that you can YouTube are hip cars. So
Yes.
CARS.
I was going to bring them up.
Segue. Here we go. So CARS stands for a controlled articular rotation, and the word articular is just referring to your joint. And the reason why they're great for mobility is because that's exactly what mobility is. It's being able to use your muscles around the joint to control a range of motion. CARS specifically, it does go through like a full circle or a full rotation, but you end up getting some extension, you get some rotation obviously, and then you bring your leg back into flexion. And so if you YouTube or Google hip CARS, CARS, you can kind of watch someone go through those full ranges of motion to see if you can do the exercise, or if you're struggling in one way or another, or leaning too far over, what have you.
Yeah, I find the hip cars are very telling of where you might be lacking for parts that like either feel pinchy, or like I know I need to work on flexion a bit, and sometimes like my glutes and hamstrings will cramp up when I get to that point of the cars, which is kind of funny, but really uncomfortable. But yeah, I think those are great just for like a quick assessment. Like, can I even go through this movement?
Yeah, and being able to go both directions. So if you watch a video, hopefully they have it going clockwise and counterclockwise, but there are different mobility requirements for going either direction. So it's really important that you try it both ways on both legs, and you can do it standing. I've seen people do it standing. I've seen people do it like on their hands and knees. Like if you're gonna do it camel, but you can kind of go through a range of motion there. I generally like to give it to people in a standing position if they can tolerate it, just because it tends to be more functional, and you can kind of work on a lot of different things in that exercise, like glute activation, core, posture,
Balance.
balance. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I should do this myself, but it's a really good warm-up exercise too.
Yes.
Before
yeah,
running.
it's a good run. Or pre-lift, like if you're going to do like lower body stuff.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit more about your favorite hip mobility exercises?
Oh, I'm on a kick right now of this one that I love. I love to do it for myself. I love to give it to people, and it's funny. Or it's not funny. I shouldn't say that, but it's interesting to give it to people, and then a lot of people just like have a hard time with it, and then it's really interesting to watch someone do it a few times, and then it does become a lot easier. But it's called a hip 90-90, Maybe we've done this together, Kelly. I
I
can't
love
remember.
the
So
90/90s.
oh, it feels so good. And it's like dynamic. You get
Hmm.
like you work on both hips at the same time. But that's an exercise. If you look up hip 90/90s, you have one leg in front of you like a pigeon pose. So it's like a figure four position. And then your back leg is just reverse of that. So your foot's behind you and your knee's kind of at a 90-degree angle. And so you sit in this position and then you can either alternate and rotate your legs kind of forward and back. So at one point, your right leg will be in front of you, your left leg behind you, and then you can switch to face the other direction so that your right leg's in front of you, your left leg's behind you. I can't remember what I said first, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then you can also add in a hip lift into that. I hope this is making sense with my words. Yeah, so if I start with my right leg in front and my left leg behind me, in that same position, before I rotate, I'm going to try to lift my hips up. And that helps you work on hip mobility in a couple of ways. You'll get some glute activation. You get a little pelvic tilt at the end of that, but it just exaggerates both the like internal and external rotation of that exercise, and then you're also getting some hip extension. So I just like that exercise because it feels good and you just can work on everything all at once together versus feeling like you have 5 exercises to do that work on all the different parts of your mobility, because who has time for that? Nobody. Wants to do that? Nobody. So the hip 90/90 with a lift.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's how you can find it in YouTube or Google.
I'll find it. I'll link them.
It on my Instagram actually, because I was doing it. I've been giving it for a while, so I might have made a video, maybe not, or I will. After this, I will.
Yeah, here's some content for you.
The last one,
well, before you say another one,
yeah,
the addition that you put onto my 90/90s was when I'm in the 90/90 position, not doing the hip lift, but leaning forward and lifting my foot. The foot lifts.
I literally was going to say this. That's what I was going to say next. Was
Oh,
this exercise.
good. Those are freaking hard.
They're
if you're
really
like
hard.
tired.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because it does take some brain energy for sure to like, what am I doing?
And just the muscles. They get so tired so quickly.
Yeah. And again, it's like in that specific position and in that exercise, it's quite possible that your hips are kind of at their end range. So usually they're maybe at their end range internal rotation or end range external rotation. And then you're using your muscle to gain a little bit more of that range, which is ideally what we want. Like if we're trying to increase mobility, we want our muscles to do that, to help us increase that range of motion. Because again, mobility is active. So when you're in any sort of, especially that 90/90 position, yeah, like I gave you, and I think Kelly, I gave you where you're trying to lift your back foot off the ground. Yeah, so that's helping you get a little bit more internal rotation. Yes, that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that one it's nice. I remember when you first gave it to me, I can't remember if that was a day that you made me run at the office. Because normally I come to you normally on rest days. So I'm usually really tired. and then you had me do the 90/90s with the leg lift at the end, and I like couldn't move my foot. And you were just like, what is going on? It was like my glutes cramping, my hamstrings cramping.
And it was like the end of the day too. It was like 5:00.
Yeah.
Tired. But hopefully it has felt easier.
Oh yeah, whenever I do it, I like to do it at the end of my lifting sessions now, and I'm just like, wow, my foot goes so much higher.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I love the idea of doing it at the end too.
Yeah. Well, so for my warm up, I go through like, this is also, part of this is good for hip mobility and just like stretching of the muscles around it. I do like an inchworm into, what's that pose? Like, is it a runner's lunge? I think it's a runner's lunge, where you basically put your foot where your hand was, and then you do like the greatest stretch of all time, and you twist into it.
Yes.
And then I do a pigeon pose too. So it's like that loop a couple times. Yeah, that's my warm
I
up.
love that. Yeah, I love that. It's nice to find dynamic loops like that where you feel like you're getting a bunch of things at once.
Hmm.
Uh, and they're saying, that dynamic is better before. So trying to dynamically warm up things is good.
Yeah, and I will say, I remember back like maybe 10 years ago when I used to do yoga, like going from a plank to putting my foot where my hand was impossible. Like could not put my foot up there for the life of me. I'd have to like step and then get it up kind of. Um, but now since I've been doing that warm up for like a couple years, it's so much easier. Like I can
That's
easily get into
awesome.
that position. So that's just really cool to see.
Yes. That's awesome. That's awesome. And that kind of speaks to just with a lot of these things, like if you're working on hip mobility or ankle mobility, it really does take time and consistency. Sometimes that means like doing a little bit every day. I think a lot of like the stretching research says that you need to do like 5 minutes a day, at least 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week
Hmm.
to find some sort of change.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, it just really takes time. Like, I feel like I hear people like, I am working on my ankle mobility and it is not changing. You probably feel that way. Actually, now that I'm saying that aloud.
I do. I think I told you this. The one time I did see improvement, or maybe was telling another PT on Endeavor Run. Anyway, I was following the stretching in Anatomy for Runners.
Yeah.
So it's basically you put a towel under your big toe and then
Yeah.
stretch your Achilles for 3 minutes each side. And I think it was 5 or 6 days a week for like 3 months. And I don't know why I ever stopped because my ankle mobility did get better because my like
Yeah.
Achilles like slightly lengthened, so that was less of a limiter. Although, as you know, my bones still like they don't like to glide how they're supposed to, so that's a different issue. But yes, it took a long time and a lot of like 3 minutes is long per side.
It is a long time when you're just having to sit and do one thing. It's a long
Mhm.
time, and um, I know I've been guilty of this too. I think once we start to see improvement, we kind of lose consistency. Like we're like, oh, it's getting better, and then without truly knowing it, we find ourselves just like not doing it anymore. And
Mhm.
I'm totally guilty of that. But like anything else with running, it you have to be consistent with it all, which is like annoying to say, annoying to hear, but it really is true. And when you think about um, you know muscle stiffness and joint stiffness, there's times when you're adding more training, whether that's like load or intensity or whatever, where there's going to be that stiffness that happens afterwards, and so we have to mitigate or we have to work on that, right? Like if we only stretch like once a week, but we're constantly adding this like load that like kind of stiffen things up for a period of time, well, then that's going to speak louder than the stretching that we're doing, for 1 minute
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
couple times a week. Um, so it's really finding that balance that works for you and finding the exercises that use both stretching and active muscle activation to target all aspects of mobility.
Yeah. So I guess as we conclude this discussion, what are what are some exercises for ankle mobility and hip mobility that are like not the ones that we've already mentioned, but maybe have more of a strength component too?
Ooh. Well, for ankle mobility, I feel like so your tibialis anterior is
Mhm.
your muscle that lives on the front of your shin, and it controls the ability to pick up your foot. So when we're talking about active exercises for ankle mobility, I feel like I give this exercise a lot. And I probably have. I think I know I've given it to you, Kelly. I'm like very sure. When we're putting like our foot up on a chair and we're trying to bring our knee over our foot and back, we're just like doing these back and forth lunges to work on the dorsiflexion of our ankle when our foot is planted. So you're working on bending your ankle while it's up on a chair, which is like a great way to work on that dynamic range of motion. Um, but to make it more active, there's two ways to do it. Either you move forward into dorsiflexion and then you try to pick up your foot,
Oh.
hold that for like 5 seconds, put your foot back down, see if you can move your knee a little bit further. Then once your knee's there, try to pick up your foot. It's barely going to come off the bench or the chair, but you're activating that tibialis anterior for 5 to 10 seconds. Put it back down, see if your knee goes further, and that's like a contract relax kind of PNF type of stretching. Or if you stand with your back against the wall as if you were going to do like a wall sit, so your feet are out in front of you, knees are straight, or they can be a little bit bent, but instead of sitting down, you stay there and you try to pick your toes up off the ground. So you're specifically working your tibialis anterior, and you can do it without a weight or without anything. Just literally try that 15 to 20 times and tell me if you can do more than one set. I think it's tiring. And I would start with just 2 feet at the same time and then see if you can do 1 foot, like stand on 1 foot and try it. It's hard. It's like mildly demoralizing. I'm like, oh man, I should be able to do this.
That's how I feel whenever you bring up calf raises.
The demons of calf raises.
Yeah, because what do you say? You should be able to do 25 single leg calf raises?
25 single leg, and if we're really being specific, there's some research that says you should be able to do that with 1.5 times your body weight.
Excuse me?
I know. Yeah. My eyes are as wide as yours. Yeah, just by nature of like the explosivity and the power that you need in your ankle, and then also just like when you land, your body's taking up like 2 to 3 times your body weight, they say. So like your tendons need to be able to withstand at least 1.5 times your body weight. So being able to hold that much weight in a calf raise without feeling like you can't go up and down the stairs the next day.
So we should all be doing calf raises with much heavier weight.
With much heavier weight.
I mean, we currently are.
Yeah, like obviously, like build yourself up safely and slowly, but yeah, absolutely. And it tends to be too like the exercise that's really probably which is really helpful for any sort of tendinitis that's happening at the foot, like Achilles tendons, even plantar fasciitis. Like those tendons need load; they need like heavy load at some point. So yeah, go in that direction might just help be preventative too.
Yeah, good to know.
Yeah. So I would say that exercise, like picking up your foot for ankle mobility, those are like great places to start. I truly feel with both joints, as we're talking about exercises, it does not need to be complicated. It does not need to take you forever. Truly, like find 1 or 2 things that work for you so that you know you can be consistent. Like if you have this big beautiful program but it just feels cumbersome and you can't do it before you run or before you lift or whatever, then it doesn't matter. Like then that's not the program that works for you. So find like 2 to 3 things per joint that are active that are going to help you be consistent before you run. For hips, again, hip cars are really great. The world's greatest stretch is a good one that Kelly was talking about. You get a lot of ranges of motions there. The hip 90-90 lifts, those are awesome. Even just standing in a lunge position, so 1 foot in front, 1 foot behind, and trying to tilt your pelvis like we were talking about. So when 1 foot's in front and 1 foot is behind, your back foot can just be, like it doesn't have to be fully planted. Your heel doesn't have to be on the ground. Just the ball of your foot can be on the ground. But in that position, can you tuck your tailbone down to posteriorly tilt, and then can you bring it forward? And you'll feel as you tuck your tailbone down that your back leg will get a nice big stretch in the front. And you're using your glute to be able to do that motion. So it is an active mobility thing. And then, of course, switch sides, anteriorly, posteriorly tilt. And that position is a really good one, too. You can do it in a lunge position. You can also do it kneeling. So if you kneel on your back foot or your back knee, and then your front leg is forward in a 90-degree position, you can do the same thing.
That one's one of my favorites because I feel because I don't know if they're tight. I say tight a lot, but my hip flexors always feel like they want to be stretched, which makes sense because I'm sitting all day. So they want to be in a different position, and that just feels really nice on the leg that's behind me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to go off of that, like, I feel like there's a lot of talk about, like, don't stretch your hip flexors. which I'm like, okay, don't tell people never to do that. Like, it does feel good.
It feels so good.
Good. And that's what we do in yoga. Like, we stretch things and it feels good. There is an appropriate time to stretch something. So I don't want people to think that they should never do it. However, I think that it's not a this or that conversation. It's definitely like you have to do both. So if anything is feeling tight, hip flexors, anything in your hip, anything in your ankle, like we're saying, I'll say it again, you have to add activation to it, or you have to have like an active muscle component to that. And they're finding that dynamic exercises or strength training does increase your muscle length. It does increase your mobility. So I think that you have to do both. You have to find this nice balance between stretching because it feels good and it does change a muscle length to some extent. And then at some point you have to put input back into it so that it doesn't feel chronically tight.
Yes. So 2 parts, not just one.
Not just one. Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything that we missed that you want to address before we sign off?
Ooh.
I think we hit everything we intended to hit.
Yeah. No, that was great. I think it's really fun to talk about mobility stuff because I think again, with running, with any sport, but with running, I feel like I see a lot of people forget about the fundamentals, and that's what you need for literally any sport. Like if you want to play basketball, you have to learn how to dribble, you have to learn how to shoot a free throw, you have to learn the drills, all the things. You have to spend time on that stuff. And it's the same for running. So like you need a proper hip mobility, you need proper ankle mobility, like literally mobility everywhere. You have to stabilize it. So you have to be able to have balance and stabilization of a joint, and then you have to be able to produce power at that joint. So, so finding a routine that works for you to work on, both as like a warm up and then as like a separate, I'm just going to work on some of these things as I start to run more, or even if you're just a runner that just wants to be a consistent, happy runner, you're like not racing, but you just like want to be able to run a certain amount of miles for the rest of your life. Awesome. You still have to make sure that you have the foundations to support whatever that is. So that's a really important thing to remember. And as always, as you're focusing on these different joints, remember that you do have to put them all back together at some point. So if you're working on hip mobility, if you're working on ankle mobility, those two things do go hand in hand. Like my hips move one way and it does affect the way my foot moves. So at some point you have to put those all together and then practice it while you're running. To summarize for today.
That was an excellent summary.
Thank you.
And if anyone wants to see you in person, you have yourself and a new physical therapist taking on people. So I'll link PR Labs, where you work, in the show notes. Obviously, I go to Sarah, so highly recommend her.
Thank you, Kelly. Right back at you,
Thanks.
Miss Run Coach. I know, woo woo.
I know. By the time this comes out, so this will come out March 29th. So we'll have only 4 more business days left.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
That is less than a full week of work.
I know. Hopefully by that point I'll be more chilling than transitioning.
But it's okay if you're not.
Yeah.
It's still happening, which is so exciting.
I know. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for this. I think this will be really helpful. And I'll link all of your contact information if anyone wants to reach out to you, wants to book with you, or just follow you.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having me again. I always love these conversations.
Me
So thank
too. They're always so fun.
you.